So do we have our online thing? Is it working?
Yes, it's all working. Yep.
So happy to welcome colleagues from economics, ag econ, and others. Dr. Judith Scott-Clayton is going to be talking today. She is a colleague from Teachers College, Columbia, and has a doctorate from the Kennedy School, Wellesley, and has been a customer of the OLDA for a number of years, as many of you are in this room. Lisa was joking with me, we should probably pass out like a customer satisfaction survey in this room. We get a lot of responses. And she's also had some significant roles, both at NVER, but also in the federal government when she was kind of seconded to Council of Economic Advisors during Biden administration. So I respect her and I followed her career closely. I don't think we actually physically met until last night at dinner, which is kind of bizarre, but it's just more a testament to me. I'm kind of a hermit in Ohio. But thank you very much for visiting us here in Ohio in my hermitage, and welcome, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you. Awesome. Well, thank you for having me. It is a delight to be here. I was just saying, I think originally, I've been working with the Ohio data, and we had been trying to find a time to come out and actually present some of the work using the Ohio data back in 2020, and events interceded in that. So it's taken a minute to get out here, but I'm delighted to be here to present this new work, this new project, not using the Ohio data, but certainly using very similar data, and the Ohio data could be used to construct many of the types of measures that we're going to look at in this paper, which is joint with my colleague Veronica Minaya at the Community College Research Center, and two graduate students, CJ Lavasi and Joshua Thomas. And just to start out with a little bit of context and motivation, with which you guys are probably, you may already be pretty familiar based on, media commentary about the state of the labor market for recent college graduates. So this is just showing unemployment rates over time, and the light blue line are young college graduates, so 22 to 27. And if you wanted to compare them either with the all workers rate or with other young workers, with all young workers, you can see that the blue line is kind of, the unemployment rates have looked like they're doing something a little bit different in recent years. So there's a lot of anxiety about that, what's going on there. And in spite of that, it's still true, bachelor's degree premium is still, despite stagnating over the past decade or so, it still remains at, near its peak. So about a 75% premium above a high school diploma. But certainly those early years can be rocky, and it looks like maybe deteriorating recently. And then also laying in this context is student debt. And as repayment is coming back to the fore, wage garnishment potentially going to restart soon. And how's that going to intersect with this kind of context? Another piece of motivation are socioeconomic gaps in earnings. So this is kind of a stylized fact. You could observe this in other data sets. Chetty et al., for example, have highlighted socioeconomic gaps in earnings, even for students who went to similar colleges. This is from our data, so I'll tell you much more about the data in a minute. Looking at median earnings 1, 5, and 10 years after graduation. And again, you can see 5 years later, 10 years later, bachelor's degree grads, and I'll just say BA grads for short, they're doing pretty well on average. But, year one, you got to get through a kind of rocky period to get those, to get to that point of stability. And there are these gaps between high and low socioeconomic students, so students from families with higher or lower incomes. There are gaps that emerge right away, and then they grow over time. So we are interested in this project and thinking about the early job transition as a kind of critical period, one of these moments where things could kind of tip in different directions depending on the type of supports that that students have. And we're building on growing literature that's been focused a lot on the role of college choice and major choice in kind of unpacking variation in earnings after college. And certainly college and major are two very important factors, and they're two things that policymakers, can exercise some influence over. But what we want to point out in this paper is that there's a lot of work still to be done even after thinking about those margins. For a long time, labor economists have considered the early career period a kind of rocky and churny one, and have acknowledged that that's not necessarily a bad thing. Some of this is functional, as people are switching jobs, improving their matches, they're learning about their own abilities, or maybe acquiring new skills and then moving on to higher paying jobs. So this kind of functional churn period from the labor economics perspective is, not necessarily something to worry about. We also know from a separate strand of literature that this early period, how well it goes, can have really long-standing impacts down the line. So there are several papers using variation in economic conditions at the point of graduation to look at to what extent is this just sort of temporary shock that people recover from relatively quickly, or to what extent does it kind of scar? And the evidence is pretty consistent in finding scarring effects for 10 years or even longer for students who graduate into a recession. And as far as the mechanisms underpinning that, it looks like they might be going through that first job match. So we are kind of taking this as a starting point for thinking about the importance of that early job transition, not just throughout these cycles, economic cycles, up and downs, but cross-sectionally. What if there are certain student populations that are kind of graduating into what feels like to them kind of less good economic conditions, regardless of what point you're at in the broader economic cycle? So even if this kind of early career churn is functional from a labor economic perspective, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not something to worry about from an inequality perspective. And there, from that same recession literature I just talked about, there's some evidence that less advantaged graduates do appear to be more adversely affected and slower to recover from recessions. And there's also just a good body of descriptive research showing that these substantial gaps exist in post-college earnings by socioeconomic status, not just in the US, but other places as well. And we want to point out here that the cross-sectional gaps could be as large or even larger than the cyclical gaps. So this, again, is just a little preview of from our data. This is looking at students who either did or did not receive aid. So the top line would be the kind of higher income students. The bottom line is the lower income students, and looking at them graduating at different points in time. And you can see the recession here, these lower earnings after 5 years. But what I want to highlight in this graph is that kind of the worst point for the higher income students is still above the kind of best point for the lower income students. Oh, I also should have said, because now I feel like I'm just talking super fast, I am accustomed to being interrupted, and at some point I will be very nervous if folks don't interrupt, but maybe we're not quite there yet. We'll get a few other little bits on the table here first. Okay, actually, oops, that is. Okay. So in my other work, I've focused a lot on college access and college success. So what types of policies can help mitigate socioeconomic disadvantages in terms of who can enroll in college, who can persist through college and complete. And, so kind of acquired a lot of experience and expertise in that literature and thinking about the types of barriers and constraints that can kind of mess with people at those different margins. And, you know, it seems like probably those same issues don't like magically disappear when we get to the college exit margin. So certainly financial constraints, you know, if you don't have the same kind of family wealth buffer to get through a rocky period after graduation. You don't have the same social networks or kind of social capital to help you through that transition. Yeah, stop there. There's also roles for, you know, institutional and firm recruiting policies and how those operate in different campuses. So just to give a preview of the research questions that we're going to look at in this project, which is a 100% descriptive project. There's no causal evaluation here. We see this as kind of setting the stage for generating some hypotheses which might lead to policy experimenting and evaluation down the line. So first, using the administrative data that we have access to here, which links academic transcripts with quarterly UI data, quarterly employment and earnings, using those data to describe what does this early labor market period look like for public four-year college graduates. Second, how predictive are these measures that we construct of the initial job transition? How predictive are those experiences of earnings 5 years later, even after we account for everything that we can observe at college exit, which thanks to this, you know, thanks to administrative data is actually pretty, you know, a lot of stuff. And then finally, to what extent do differences in those experiences, how much can they account for the earnings differences that we see 5 years later? Yes, Bruce.
Introducing to encouraged questions. I'm just curious, like, to what extent is there like a distinct, you know, school to market transition? Like, my image is a lot of kids in school are working, and
yes, absolutely. Very
graduation takes a little while. So can you sort of talk to us about like that? It's not like, oh, I was in school and then they gave me a diploma and now I'm not in school.
So it's going to be a few slides from now.
I should be patient.
But absolutely, one of the first issues, and probably this is like months, that we are running around in our heads in circles with the data. What is the first job? So we'll talk about that. Okay, so just to give a preview for those who I know some of you have to leave early, bottom line is we find that differences in the first job transition can explain at least 2/3, and maybe more, of the gap in year 5 earnings that we would predict just based on people's observable characteristics at college graduation. So kind of after, you know, we look at a high SES student, a low SES student who have the same GPA, same college, same major, same in-school work experience, same GPA test scores, all those things that we can observe about them at graduation. We predict about a $5,000 gap in earnings at year 5. And we find that about 2/3 of that, we can shrink that by about 2/3 by controlling for what happens just in that early transition period. Interestingly, this is not the case. We also look at race and gender gaps. It became too much to kind of cram into one paper, but those much more emerge over time. They're less explained. So the SES gaps appear more explained by these early career metrics than do the race and gender gaps. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the data and the sample, and let me also catch myself up to make sure that I'm not getting behind. Good. All right, so we are using individual level administrative data from a large public urban university system with 11 four-year colleges. It is not necessarily a nationally representative system, but it is a large system and is highly diverse. For this project, we're focused on bachelor's degree graduates. In other work, we have kind of extended this beyond to look also at bachelor's degree leavers, associate's degree completers, and lots of other types of college leavers. For here, we're focused on bachelor's degrees. We started with them because we thought, in part, to the extent there is a, like discrete transition, this is kind of the most tractable place to start. And it is true that if you look at other types of college leavers, it's more messy. Okay, and we are focused on those who started college at age 20 or below, so a little bit more of a traditional age population. The reason for that is we're trying to look again at this first job transition. So we wanted to kind of focus on a sample that didn't already have significant labor market experience prior to starting college. Second, we are focused on bachelor's degree graduates who did not enroll in subsequent education, either in this system or in other systems. We also are able to link to National Student Clearinghouse. So we wanted to set aside students who look like they're sort of transitioning immediately into graduate school. We didn't, you could enroll in graduate school 2 years later, 3 years later, 4 years later, 5 years later. We're not excluding those because maybe that first transition, affects those later choices. We wanted to, give space for that to happen, but we're setting aside this group. Yes, there's a question. Yeah.
Just another definitional. Yeah. And entering college, is that studying full time? Is that, how do you measure that?
We did not require them to be full-time students. Off the top of my head, and it's because we have multiple projects with these data, sometimes like, did we put a restriction on this or not? I honestly, it definitely doesn't have to be full-time, that's for sure. In this particular context, the vast majority do start out full-time, maybe 85%. Okay, we link to the state quarterly earnings and UI claims data. And just to, we can talk a little bit more about all the complications of linking to single state UI data. They're all at play here. We want to make sure that this person kind of shows up at some point in the in-state labor market at some point after graduation. Otherwise, we're not sure. Did they not have a valid social security number on file? Did something else happen where they're never showing up? These data, we can't track students out of state. So if you're not working in the state, we don't know what's going on with you. We don't have any specific wage information, hours information, occupation information. We can observe the industry. And we have, for this paper, we have pseudo employer IDs, so we can see specific employers, but we don't really know which employer that is. And we'll see, to the extent people want to talk about it or follow up later, like we did a lot of diagnostics in the early part of this project about sensitivity to sample exclusions, things like that, and kind of convinced ourselves that nothing that we are doing is like dramatically affected by different decisions there, but I'm happy to try to talk through some of the considerations. Oops, did not mean to do that. How do I, okay. All right, so, advantages and disadvantages of different data sets. So it's a unique environment. It's not nationally representative. We don't have a causal variation here to work with. But the advantages are we do have very granular window where we can see right when somebody leaves school and right when they pick up different jobs. So being able to look at it like quarter by quarter has been pretty interesting. Cool. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the first job. So like I said, this is not super straightforward, in fact, because most students are working during school. And, so if you just, how are we going to define this? So this is how we defined it. The first job at which a student has 3 quarters of consecutive post-college employment with the same employer. So the goal here is to exclude kind of very transient employment relationships temporary kind of summer employment that somebody might have before they start their quote-unquote real job, or a college employer that you're kind of, finishing things off with. It could be an employer that you worked with before graduating. In fact, we'll see that's quite common, as long as it meets the conditions that you had at least 3/4 of consecutive post-college employment with the same employer. We did try to look at other definitions that folks have used. We haven't seen one using these type of quarterly earnings data, so maybe that's, if somebody's aware of one, certainly we'd like to hear it, but just based on what folks have done in other data contexts, like looking at, there's another paper that we have looked at that defined the first job as 90 days of consecutive employment with a single employer. So this is kind of, this is at least 1/4 plus a day on either side. Okay, and then for defining high and low socioeconomic status, this is also, a proxy. If anyone is familiar with a Michelmore and Donarski paper using multiple years of free and reduced price lunch status to get kind of better measures of family background, we're kind of using a similar strategy here in the higher ed context, where we're looking at over the years where we observe you enrolled, what proportion of those years did you receive a Pell Grant, which is the foundational need-based federal aid program. And so we're defining a low SES student as one who always received a Pell Grant during the time they were enrolled. High SES is those that never received a Pell Grant during the time that they were enrolled. You might wonder, why don't we just use income information directly? The reason is just a little bit logistical. And those who work in these administrative data sets may be familiar with this kind of issue. Pell Grant receipt is more consistently available and recorded over time across colleges than the FAFSA data, which is the aid application data where you can observe somebody's income. They're not available going back as long. There's more restrictions. They're just a little bit more inconsistent. So we have more complete information on Pell Grant receipts, so that's why we're using that. For the years where we have both, we can use that to say that our high SES group has a median family income of close to $100,000, whereas the low SES group has a median family income under $20,000. So these are pretty big differences. Yeah.
How many are in that? Sometimes, but not always.
That's about a third. So it nicely splits the sample into about a third, a third, a third. And when we show you, so keep that in mind when we show you these comparisons, there's a middle group that we're kind of setting aside. And also, for those of you who know about financial aid application and all the mess of that, our high SES group here could also include some low-income kids who never filed a FAFSA for one reason or another. So we think, if anything, that's going to kind of understate the gaps that we're seeing here, but just keep that in mind. All right, so there's way too many numbers in this table, and you certainly do not have to look at all of them. It's just giving some descriptives, first of our kind of big sample, and then of some restrictions we're going to place on it as we go. So a lot of our analysis, we're going to look at people who are employed in year 5, just so that we actually have an outcome measure there to look at that's not confounded with people who've moved out of state. And then for much of our analysis, we'll further restrict to those who had connected to that first employer within 4 years, which is like 95% of this group. And there's not that much change in the characteristics across these sample restrictions. Here's the Pell, so never received Pell. Our higher income group is about 29%. Our low income group is about 34%, and the remainder are in the middle. And the other thing to note here, these groups are very different. So high SES and low SES, it's not like the only thing that's different about these groups is their family income. This is bundling a lot of other differences: gender, race, lots of stuff. You could look through this table. So So we're going to want to account for that, right? So when I talk about a residual SES gap, in this context, what I'm meaning is the socioeconomic gap in earnings, comparing observably similar graduates at the point of graduation. Observably similar in all these background characteristics, as well as in terms of what they did while they were in college. All right, so just a few graphs to give you a flavor of what's going on for graduates here. So this graph is showing by quarter since graduation. So this is a quarter of graduation, so like the second quarter for a May graduate. But we do have people graduating at different times, so it's easiest to think about like a May graduate, Q2. So we look quarters after graduation, how many students have connected with their first job by each point in time. And we split the sample by our high SES and low SES. So just to highlight a couple of points here. So at the quarter of graduation, between 35 and 40%, depending on which group we're looking at here, have already connected with their first significant post-college employment. They've already connected with that employer prior to graduation. And I didn't do the graph where we could look at this before, but like a lot of that has happened within the past year to 18 months prior to graduation. So I don't know if that number is surprising or not surprising, but it's a large number, and there's a non-trivial difference in this right away between high and low income graduates, with the high income graduates being more likely to have already connected with that employer before leaving. Yeah.
Just to clarify what you said, prior to zero, there were a certain fraction of the high and low SES individuals who retained employment after they graduated.
Yes.
With the same.
Yes.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
That's interesting.
Yes. And again, they had to have at least 3 quarters after graduation. So we only start counting that once they graduate, but then we look back to see when did you start at that employer.
And that seems like an important acknowledgement, partly because I noticed if you go back to the descriptive slide, there isn't a real big difference between from my perspective, on the number of quarters worked during enrollment. I mean, I wouldn't have said it's a huge difference. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, 48%
Well, I was looking,
40%.
yeah, you're right. But that.
There's definitely something going on during school. Some things that I think could be room to unpack what those work experiences look like during school, differentially for the high and the low SES kids. Right now, we'll account for in school quarters of employment, but we haven't broken this out by like what type of employer, was it related to a major, things like that. Okay, so a lot of students already have that, have connected by the time they graduate. Then, there is a lot going on in that first year. Whoops. So this is after 1 year, just a little bit under, it's about 75% have connected with their first employer by a year out. Yes.
Their first significant.
First significant employer, so you guys are raring to see this chart, which is, okay, so this is the first significant employer. Not the same as you're working. Most students are working before they finish. Most students are working after they finish. It goes up a little bit after they finish, but not actually all that much, right? And this one is cumulative, so, over time, some land the first job and then they leave, or they drop out of the labor force, or they go back to school or whatever. So, in the latter period, that's why the 2 lines cross. But yes, so just because you haven't connected with your first significant employer does not mean that you are not working. Yes?
How do you think about self-employed?
They are not in these data.
Okay.
I would love to hear how anyone is thinking about that. I mean, it's Yeah, it's not covered in the data.
So they would be coded as not
Zeros.
working.
They're not working. They're not employed in a UI covered job.
It may be a distraction and you can sort of wave it up. But I guess I'm a little surprised that the lower SES students have less in-school employment. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. And also I wonder if, I would have been prepared to believe that they had sort of crappier jobs, like, oh, I'm trying to make some money and so I'm doing something, and you know, the high SES students are like doing something that's maybe not paying well, but like could lead to, you know, a longer term. But do you have any thoughts on that you want to?
I agree. It is a little surprising. So I guess the couple thoughts that I have are students do get in the system. It's a relatively affordable public system. They do get significant financial aid. So maybe that's part of it. Or they could be working in jobs that are not, they could be more likely to be working in jobs that are not covered. And I think we could do more to think about whether there are other ways that we could try to get at that a little bit. They do have some student survey data, something that might be able to just give a flavor of to what extent that could be going on. But, you know, folks are maybe doing, sorry?
DoorDash or
They could be doing something like that, or they could be doing childcare or other types of informal work that wouldn't be covered here. Okay. All right, so even though on average, you know, the typical graduate is making median incomes look good if you compare graduates to non-graduates. Certainly the graduates have better outcomes than non-graduates. And yet still, you know, this chart is showing a few different metrics of kind of labor market stress or you know, so the top lines are, did you have any quarter in which you had zero earnings, a whole quarter, in the third to sixth quarter after graduation? So setting aside the first 6 months, let that chaos period settle down a little bit, just look over the next 4 quarters. And we see, of course, this varies with the economic cycle, but you know, more than 1 in 4, and in some cases closer to 1 in 3, have depending on the year, have a full quarter of zero earnings. That's pretty uncomfortable for anybody. And probably more uncomfortable if you are from a low-income family that may not have as much resources to kind of support you through that. The second measure here is whether your annual earnings over all 4 quarters was below the poverty line. And so this, over the whole period, its average is about 1 in 5. And then finally, the light gray lines here are whether you had any UI claim within 2 years of graduation. And you can see that, you know, back in the recession, this was between 10 to 15% claiming UI within 2 years of graduation. All of these gaps between low and high SES appear smaller during kind of better economic conditions, which is what you would probably expect based on prior literature. So this is kind of a stressful period. It's I think, you know, a lot of times I feel like as a economist, we're always just pumping up, you know, bachelor's degrees, and they are a good investment. They do pay off on average, and the recent grads are just like rolling their eyes, like, who are you talking about? What reality are you living in? Like, and I think some of that has to do with, you know, recognizing that even within these kind of decent averages and strong payoff over time, you know, these early periods can be really rough. And for the high, you know, frankly, for the high SES kids as well. So thinking about, you know, what kind of policies do we have in place for folks to navigate this, and what can colleges do to help students navigate this. Final little descriptive piece before we move on. This chart is from a related paper where we're looking at other types of college leavers, but we can just focus on the first bar here, the bachelor's degree recipients, and just in terms of how many jobs they hold in the first 5 years, it's close to 3.5. Just kind of shocked, actually lines up reasonably well with older data from NLSY on college grads and their early career mobility. On average, they work for about 2 different industries, and at the 5th year, only about a third are still in the first job. So another just kind of data point, whatever that first job is, the majority of students have moved on from that by year 5. Okay, so now let's plug this in to think about how much this initial job transition explains year 5 earnings. So as I mentioned, we don't have a causal framework here, so this sort of messy chaos figure is one just kind of giving you a sense of the specific type of predictors that we have in different buckets. So we have at the top kind of fixed student characteristics, as well as like family background stuff, as well as pre-college measures of achievement or preparation, high school GPA, SAT or ACT scores for the large majority that have them in the data. Then we have a bunch of end of college predictors describing what the student was studying, which specific campus they were at, what year they left college, their work experience, GPA, how long they took. We've got a bunch of early career transition metrics, including a measure of how matched the industry was to your major, firm size and firm average wage, firm industry, how long it took you to find your first job. The big thing that's going to explain a lot here is just your own salary at that first job. And we're not really trying to overinterpret or focus on any one coefficient in this massive regression that we're going to run. It's more about trying to understand, in decomposing variation in year 5 earnings, how much does this bucket add to the overall explanatory power of this prediction. So we run a descriptive regression, and I think I've kind of already talked through what those variables are. Okay, so long story short, initial job transitions are highly predictive of year 5 earnings for bachelor's degree grads. When we look just at sort of everything except, everything at the point of graduation that we know about you in the data, we can predict about 14% of year 5 earnings. We can improve that to about 35% when we add in the first job measures. And like I said, it's a little tricky to interpret individual coefficients, but broadly what we're finding is kind of consistent with what some other literature has found around large employers appearing to have kind of a positive, appears like they have a premium, as well as getting a job in a major matched industry. We can talk about this one. When we presented this to the system, which is providing the data, they kind of wanted to take that very literally, like, okay, it's important that we get students jobs in a matched industry. That is not how I would interpret this. It's more, and this is something where I feel like it's careful for economists when they're trying to communicate what they're doing and why they're doing it. It's more about this being a proxy for there's something about that job that is a good match with your skills. It's not so much that you need to be in a specific industry, but just so the message to the sort of career services folks at this institution was not, please make sure you're getting students into these matched industries, but consider that there is a premium for getting a job where your skills are a particularly good fit. Whether that's in a specific industry or not, like, we don't want you to take that away from it. It's more a proxy for a underlying benefit to kind of the skill match. This is not too surprising. First job own salary, highly related to year 5 earnings, but also the first job, even on top of that, the average salary paid at the firm where you get your first job also has a significant benefit. And there's some indication, I don't want to totally overinterpret this because it's a little bit sensitive, but it kind of looks like there might be a benefit to, given the same salary, you want to work at a firm where there's more kind of growth potential. So it actually looked like it's better for your salary to be lower relative to the firm average. Okay, great. We have a few more to get to the punchline, and then happy to discuss further. All right, so coming back to this first chart that we started with, looking at earnings gaps in year 5, these are just raw unadjusted gaps. So once we control for everything that we can observe at graduation, your major, your GPA, which college you attended, all that stuff, this kind of raw gap shrinks down to, I have more slides before we get there. I'll just say that it shrinks down to about half that. So in your head, you can have that the adjusted gap is about $5,000 at year 5. Okay, so how are we going to decompose that gap? It's similar in style and motivation to a Oaxaca-Blinder decomposition, if you're familiar with those. Again, no causal magic here. We're just trying to see what features can account for the observed gap. So basically, we're using that same regression that we showed before, but we're going to add in buckets of characteristics in buckets and track how this coefficient on the low income or low SES dummy, how does this shrink as we add additional characteristics. Okay, so here is our adjusted gap, our kind of starting point. Just putting in the first job salary alone cuts that by more than half. And then putting in everything else about that first job transition cuts it even further, giving us a total of about a 2/3 reduction in the gap. We could have added a bar here where we kind of do this the other way around and just control for everything but the first job salary, and that's not in here, but it would be like here. So, definitely if you only had one thing, you'd take this, but this stuff is also fairly predictive. Okay, so here's where I was saying, just for context, it's not the focus of the paper, but for context, here's our analysis of the socioeconomic gap and how it changes when we add in these first job metrics. And here's the same kind of analysis for the adjusted gender gap and the adjusted race gaps in earnings at year 5. And what you can see, first of all, is the SES gap is, it's about as large as the black-white earnings gap in year 5. And it's about 2/3 the size of the gender gap. But the first job measures appear much more explanatory for the SES gaps than they do for the other types of gaps. I'm not honestly 100% sure what to make of that. I'm not sure, does that mean it's particularly worrisome or particularly not worrisome? I don't know, but it does suggest, or at least what I think it suggests, is that if, especially thinking from the college perspective, colleges, policymakers may have levers of influence over the first job transition that might make a difference for the SES gap. Okay, yes,
Do
please.
you happen to have the intersection of gender and LOA and SES?
We certainly could.
Yeah.
I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know what that would look like, but we certainly could do that. Yeah. So far what I've shown you is a fairly simple decomposition method. I actually kind of like simple. Don't necessarily feel the need to do more than that. The simple method is sort of taking account of everything we can observe at graduation and kind of giving that explanatory priority. But in doing so, it may understate the first jobs role because of the correlations between all these things. It may be that we're putting some explanatory power onto those background characteristics or college characteristics that actually are just due to their correlation with what happens in the first job transition. So there's this well-known issue with decomposing gaps that the order in which you enter these variables can kind of change the storyline. So the way I would interpret the storyline so far is sort of we're weighing against finding a role for the first job by controlling for everything else first. But it might be a little bit overly conservative, might actually understate the role of the first job phase. So we also have incorporated this kind of fancier method by Gelbach into 2016, who has an order invariant method for decomposing these types of gaps. And indeed, when we do that, we find that the first job metrics actually could explain about half of the big raw gap, so that $9,000 or $10,000 gap, or about 3/4 of the gap that we would predict based on observables at graduation. Yes.
Like a data, basically a question about how you organize this, but I don't know which way is right. Basically, I have similar UI linked data, and I have this problem where like people have lots of jobs, and so like, how are you thinking about like total wage from the first significant job, and then looking at the total wage from the significant job later on? Are you doing like total wage?
Yeah, so there's 1,000 ways, and in these type of data, I'm sure you can all identify. It is so easy to just go down and like just never come back up.
Yeah, that's what I am, right?
Yeah. So what I would say to that is the number one most important thing is to take a step and move forward, and then you can like sensitivity test to some extent, but at some point you just got to choose something. So the first job is as defined earlier. If there is, the first job is the first employer at which you had 3 consecutive quarters of employment. If there was a tie there, we went with the higher earning one. But to get the earnings for the first job, we look at the second quarter. So you have to be employed for 3 quarters with that employer. So we look at the second quarter and multiply that by 4 to get your annual, because that way you know it's a full quarter. So that's like an annualized starting salary would be a kind of way to think about that. For year 5 earnings, it's literally your annual earnings in year 5, conditional on you had positive earnings in year 5.
That makes, so I was thinking another reason this could be understated is because I found in my setting, which is different, that like people have way more jobs at year 1 than year 5. And so it could just be related to that. Okay, that was your way around. Okay.
Yes. And we do also include as a control how many jobs you had, I think in the first X years, which is less than 5. Remember exactly, we defined it. Okay, the other, I think thing that was a little surprising to us, when we do this decomposition, now we can put the power of the first job, kind of explanatory power, in the context of the full model of all the things, demographics, college experiences. And what we found in doing this was that major choices, which are important and have gotten a lot of attention, and we have power to shift these things, they actually don't, and they are very related to year 5 earnings, but they don't do a lot to explain SES gaps in our setting. Meaning, in this case, the major choices, if anything, would predict a larger SES gaps. It's not like the low-income kids are all going into the low earnings majors. So that was interesting. All right, so this is literally my last slide. very proud of myself for the timing here. Okay. So what we found here, motivation here is that, college degrees pay off on average, but the years after can be a little precarious, and how students fare during that period appears to be a powerful predictor of socioeconomic gaps later in life. So as we have begun presenting this around, everybody wants to know, like, okay, so like what should we be doing about this? And it's very difficult. Like, people want to know, people come up and be like, well, so should my kid take this specific job? Oh, I don't know. It's hard to go from here to, like, within 3 months, definitely, if the salary offer is over. It's hard to be that specific about it. But it's been productive to kind of start that conversation in terms of, okay, what kind of implications can we definitely draw, and what are really hypotheses, and we're looking to, continue forward maybe with some experimentation around career advising, maybe financial aid policy. Would it be crazy to think about financial aid policy that extends just a little bit beyond graduation? In a way, it kind of does with student loan policies, where you don't have to start repaying immediately, but is there more that could be done there? So I'll stop there, and I will welcome your comments and further questions.
Did you notice any relationship between the first job industry and high versus low SES graduates? Not the major, but what they ended up doing?
I would say, like, first of all, it's a little hard to summarize because there are just so many industries. When we did the decomposition, so it's a little hard to interpret the magnitudes here, but so industry does kick in as, like, an important thing relative to, say, major, which is actually negative. It's going in the wrong direction. Industry is, modestly explanatory, but it's not, like, huge. So there's a little sense that low-income grads are going into less higher paid industries, but it's not enormous.
I wondered if there are questions online. Oh, there's people here.
Hi. So I'm wondering if you're able to control for the location of their first job. I'm imagining that there's some correlation between being low SES at the time that you're entering college, and then later if they're returning back to those same locations that might be economically different.
So a couple things. One is, in our context, all of the campuses are in a single commuting zone, basically. So as far as the location of the jobs, we have not.
Could the kids be from different areas?
Oh, could the kids be from different areas?
All come to that location for school.
Yeah, we have not explored that, and I think we have zip code of residence at entry.
I would be really curious to see how much that explains.
That's a great suggestion. They definitely will be highly, a lot are coming from locally, but not all. Yeah. And there may be some variation even within the local, yeah.
Back when you showed your sample means, I was really struck by the fact that your low SES sample is heavily Hispanic,
Yes.
He doesn't use English.
Yes, yeah.
It's an immigrant.
There is a large, it's a very diverse system for sure. A lot of immigrant, not necessarily non-citizen, but that's one reason why, definitely in terms of the labor market matching, we definitely wanted to make sure we had a match at least sometime after graduation in case there was anything about, inability to like people not having a social security number, yeah.
So it seems you have enough data that you could do a decomposition, it sort of, roughly speaking, immigrant versus non within SES category and get a handle on how much of this is the immigrant effect as opposed to the SES effect.
Yeah, thank you.
Something
Yeah.
along those lines.
And yeah, I guess one complication there is if those folks are they showing up in our high SES category because they never filed FAFSA? That will be complicating. But we can dig into
You
that.
can,
Yeah, we can dig into
in
that.
one pass, give
Yes,
up on
yes,
SES
yes.
and just compare.
Yes, we
Other
could.
demographic.
Yes, we could, absolutely.
So I thinking about this in the context of other countries sometimes, and I feel like the labor market in the United States is unnecessarily optimistic for all, just because the average. So, I'm thinking like in the context of like South Africa with like 50-60% unemployment, or even a country in East Asia with like China, which has maybe 15-20% youth unemployment. These transitions look very different, and it becomes more of a question about decent work, is the way the ILO kind of observes it. How do you, thinking, if you were to future cast this 10, 20 years from now, we've got a really destructive technological regime going on, much weaker employment opportunities for all. How does first job play into it?
Yeah, I guess what concerns me just a priori is that there are these gaps for students who come from different family backgrounds, even after we control for so much stuff that we can observe. I do think, like, in getting into this project, I've done a lot of my work in community college setting, and I think I had a graph, my extra slides here, comparing, college grads to other types of college leavers, and there's some point in which it's like, should we really be obsessing about the college grads and how they're doing? Because, compared to these other groups, they are still doing quite well. But to me, there's a little bit about, just setting expectations at an appropriate level and making sure that whatever processes that we have in place aren't leading to these differential outcomes on the other side. So I'm not sure if that provides a great answer to your question, but
you might go back to some of the early '90s kind of literature on school to work and those kinds of things, which were largely done in the context of K through 12, but are relevant theoretically.
Yeah, we've looked at that.
And I think there's some similarities conceptually.
Yeah, and I think, as far as like what colleges could do, I do think it is important that graduates are aware of what these patterns look like before they get there, so that you can plan, and so that you can have some sense in mind of, at what point, if I haven't, connected with a job, it'd be good to know, are you kind of on the typical expected track? Are you way off? But also just having a plan to kind of prepare that it might be a little rocky. You might have 3 months where you don't have a salary. How are you going to deal with that? If you are working, something on the side, what type of job will still enable you to keep your search going actively and things like that. So I should have said also there's some research from the UK looking at kind of similar types of issues and finding that low SES grads start their search much later than high SES students. So starting early can be one factor. And they also find in that context, so starting early, yes, but it's not always the graduate that's driving it. Sometimes it's the school that is driving when the employers are coming for the career services and the interviews and stuff like that. So, to say low SES students get started, you got to get that job search started sooner, the school could have a role to play in that as well. Yes?
Think about the mechanisms for the gap in the kind of jobs that low and high SES students are getting to write out. There's obviously sort of possibly the parents' employment network.
Yes.
To a degree, and at the same time, I'd be curious about whether parents sort of support the residents are money down longer, more careful search, so you can hold out for the better gig. But it looks like maybe we can rule that out based on some of what you just said, but also that time to the first.
Yeah, so let's go back to that, actually, if we can really quickly. It's way back there. Because it's a little tricky because of the difference right away at graduation, there's this difference. So if we did a graph that was like conditional on you not having a job at graduation, the low-income kids are finding jobs faster. So you can see this line is steeper. So they start out lower, but they catch up within a year, and then they overtake the high SES kids. So I do think there is a possibility that is going on in the data. I don't think we've sort of nailed that yet. Yeah, I have ideas also for the future of like how we could maybe try to explore graduates facing different pressures at graduation and how does that change their job search, but we haven't gotten there yet. So I see we are out of time, so I know we're supposed to go, but I am happy to stick around.